All right, everybody, I'm Logan Alec, I'm a CPA, and there is no stimulus news today, Labor Day. Obviously a federal holiday after a weekend, so really nothing worth talking about stimulus-wise that I have not covered recently here on the channel. So I thought I would take the opportunity today to talk about something else that we should all be concerned about, whether we have school-aged children or not, because truly, children, they are our future. Yes, it's cliche, but we should all be concerned about this conversation around school reopening. So in this video, I want to talk about 3 arguments in favor of reopening schools and 2 arguments against reopening schools, so you can make up your own mind on this topic, and please let me know in the comments below your thoughts on school reopening. So school reopening is obviously a hot topic right now. I'm sure a lot of you are coming into this video with your own ideas about how schools should be approaching this. There are a lot of ideas here, things to talk about. Some people want to reopen like normal, some people want online only, some people want some kind of a hybrid between the two. I don't want to tell you whether you're right or wrong. That's not what this video is about, but hopefully it will give you some perspective into how different states, different countries are approaching education and what we can expect as we come up on the American school year. Now, of course, if you've been following Trump's recent statements, you know that he has been pushing really hard for schools to reopen for in-person learning. For example, as I told you here on the channel, early in July, Trump floated the idea of withholding federal funding from school districts that don't follow that in-person learning model. And around the same time, he tweeted in all caps and with 3 exclamation points, "Schools must open in the fall." On the other hand, his official statements haven't always been quite as emphatic. A statement from July 23rd provides a more nuanced picture of the White House's perspective. It lays out some of the most persuasive arguments for reopening. I'll put a link in the description for those of you who want to read the whole thing. But basically, the White House plan involves $105 billion in federal funding education, including $70 billion for K-12, of which $35 billion would be reserved for schools that reopen with in-person learning. And in cases where public schools didn't reopen, Trump wanted to direct funding to families so they could pay for private education, homeschooling, some kind of alternative arrangement. All right, with that intro done, now let's talk about some arguments in favor of schools reopening in the fall. Reason number 1 in favor of schools reopening in the fall is that we simply don't have the resources to provide a strong online education to our youth. The White House statement I mentioned earlier touched on some of these issues. Won't have time to cover all of them, but one point that stands out is the question of whether online education will be as helpful to children as having kids directly in the classroom. Now, part of that is due to the drawbacks of internet learning. Part of it is due to the fact that we weren't prepared for this. But the reality is that we are not going to be able to bridge that gap, at least in some cases. For example, Pew Research found earlier this year that even though 58% of 8th graders use the internet for homework all or most days, that option wasn't necessarily available for every student. In fact, 15% of homes with kids in school don't have a high-speed internet connection. That increases to 35% for low-income households, and only 75% of children living in those households have access to a computer at home. Now, that might not have been as much of an issue when kids had access to computers at school, but obviously that won't be the case if schools are closed due to COVID-19. So what that tells me is that a school's ability to run online classes is really going to depend on the students and the resources they have available. Even with federal funding, it'll be incredibly difficult to level the playing field between kids who have fast internet and their own laptop and kids who don't have those same opportunities. And I want to clarify that this was true before coronavirus, but of course remote learning is going to exacerbate this gap. So I'm not saying that we'll send kids back to school and our education will be perfect and there won't be any problems. But those problems become even bigger challenges when students, particularly young students, don't have the chance to learn at school that others do. Maybe this is a wake-up call. Maybe we can use this as an opportunity to improve educational access for all students. But until then, there will be real concerns about the quality of online education in the American school system, especially for certain groups. Reason number 2 in favor of reopening schools is that parents depend on in-person education almost as much as kids do. So even if we were able to provide the same level of instruction online, we would still have to meet the gap for working parents. If you're a parent and you work a 9-to-5 job and you don't have the opportunity to work remotely, maybe you get home an hour or 2 after your kid gets home from school. That's fine, that's workable. But what about when your kid isn't going to school? Are they actually going to be doing their schoolwork all day, logging on, or will they just be playing video games all day? And even if your kid is responsible with online learning, they'll be spending the day at home in front of a computer screen instead of at school interacting with other students. More on that in a bit. Children, especially younger children, need a certain level of social engagement, and yes, they'll still be talking to other kids on Zoom, but it doesn't replace the typical school experience. And even if you are a parent who's able to work from home, let's face it, it is extremely challenging to care for children at home while simultaneously trying to get your work done. Also, schools often cover lunch for free or at extremely low rates. School lunch is hot, and it's arguably healthy food, though healthy is debatable if you've seen some social media posts with school lunches. The point is, many schools provide lunch for free or extremely cheaply, often cheaper than food you would find at the grocery store. During a normal school year, American school lunch programs give out low-cost or free lunches to almost 30 million children every day. That means we'll need to completely overhaul the school lunch program in order to serve kids at their homes instead of at school. I know Trump and other politicians have talked about federal funding for schools. I don't want to say there isn't a solution to this issue, but I do think it will be an obstacle for districts that try to move classes online. Our society just doesn't have the infrastructure to allow working parents to leave their children, and it isn't easy to revamp something like that in a short period of time. Reason number 3 in favor of reopening schools is something I touched on previously, which is the long-term impact on children's social and emotional development from not going to school and interacting with other children. Children don't only go to school to learn their multiplication tables and how to diagram a sentence, but they also learn those vital, valuable social skills with their peers. They learn how to manage emotions, how to make friends, how to be a nice person, how to get along. And while these things can be learned in the home, let's face it, many kids don't have a strong support system within their own family. In fact, a 2010 study found that being connected to one school and social group there reduced the likelihood of substance abuse, especially among children without a strong family support system. All right, now let's move on to 2 arguments against school reopening this fall. First argument is that schools may be forced to close quickly after reopening. You may have seen the story of the girl in Georgia who took a picture of some of the crowds, kids not wearing masks at her school. She was actually suspended, though the suspension was later lifted. And this probably isn't much of a shocker, but students and teachers had tested positive for coronavirus within a week of the beginning of the school year. The outbreak had been getting worse in Georgia for several weeks before this, so it shouldn't have surprised anyone when cases started showing up in schools after reopening. So if you open too early when cases are still circulating in the community, it doesn't matter how much funding Trump promises or what you get. The reality is that schools won't be able to maintain in-person learning if cases are popping up every week. And ultimately, it's a question of whether you're able to contain the spread, limit the number of new cases, and manage those flare-ups. Testing, contact tracing, quarantining, etc., and other strategies. The key here is that you get things under control first, then you reopen. You can't just decide to reopen and hope that somehow, miraculously, I guess, everyone avoids contracting a disease that's already infected millions of Americans and has picked back up after slowing down in April and May, though it's kind of trending down again, thankfully. Of course, you can't keep schools open during an ongoing outbreak, so it's important to use the data we have to determine in advance whether that's a possibility and make a decision based on that information. In response, some school districts have announced that they're transitioning to digital learning in anticipation of the shutdowns that will take place if they reopen too early and exacerbate the outbreak. And certain districts that went the other way are ending up back where they started, except they spent the whole summer planning for in-person education instead of preparing for the possibility that they could be forced to quickly move back to a digital learning environment. So with that in mind, I think it could make more sense for districts to start online and consider bringing kids back for in-person learning after case counts drop, rather than opening up and closing again during the first weeks of school. Okay, so the next point I want to mention has to do with children spreading COVID-19. Now, Trump has really focused on the fact that kids don't tend to get as sick as adults, particularly older people and people with comorbidities, other conditions that make the virus worse in the body. For example, the White House statement pointed out that minors make up less than 7% of all coronavirus cases and less than 1/20th of 1% of all coronavirus deaths. I'm not a doctor, not an expert, but it seems to be true that children are less likely to get COVID-19, and if they do get it, they're less likely to have a severe case than someone who's older. One CDC study that was released in April, so early on the American outbreak, found that less than 2% of reported cases involved minors. Now, the problem with this logic, well, there are a few potential issues, but one obvious one is that just because kids generally get over the virus quickly doesn't mean they can't spread it to teachers, family members, friends, grandparents, etc. If you remember in February and March, people were just starting to talk about social distancing, and it wasn't just social distancing from older people or people who were in high-risk groups. Yes, that might be better than nothing, but the point of social distancing more generally generally was to minimize the opportunities the virus has to spread. And even one weak link in that social distance chain could have far-reaching effects. For example, in multi-generational households where you have grandparents or even great-grandparents living with the parents and the children, it's obviously conceivable that the 10-year-old child or the 40-year-old parent may contract COVID-19. They may be fine, not fatal, but they may pass it on to 90-something great-grandma, which obviously poses greater risks. And of course, if the kids start going to school, they're going to be touching desks, hanging out with other students who may not be social distancing as well at home. So you get the picture. So even if most kids bounce back, that doesn't mean they can't be vectors for the virus. There's some conflicting data here. It's hard to say exactly what the risks are, but there is some evidence that opening schools has led to outbreaks in other countries. I'll talk more about France in a bit. For example, one study in Shanghai and Wuhan found that children were about 1/3 as likely as adults to catch COVID-19 while out of school, but that difference basically disappeared once schools reopened. And cases went up by a factor of 30 times after schools reopened in Israel, leading to more than 2,000 school infections, including both students and staff. So not only is there a chance that you'll be forced to close the schools, but reopening could also pour gas on the fire if you don't really have a strong hold on the virus to begin with. Sure, you can close down, but by the time you realize the outbreak is happening, all those kids will have potentially infected their parents, grandparents, and other relatives. In the same way that staying open to save the economy could actually backfire by making the virus worse and delaying the recovery, reopening to save education could have the same effect by making it take even longer to prepare for sustainable in-person learning. And I'm concerned that we're going to see this play out across the country, that without a clear plan for reopening, we could infect thousands or tens of thousands of people for maybe a few weeks of school. Just look at what's happening worldwide. France, for example, is experiencing record coronavirus outbreaks as schools are reopening and has had to shut down numerous schools as a result, which touches on a point I made earlier. So this is a complicated issue. It's not black and white. I think the problem is that many people just view this issue through their own lens. Maybe an upwardly mobile nuclear family in the suburbs, they don't know anybody who has contracted COVID-19, they don't have any comorbidity strongly associated with COVID-19 deaths. They may feel very strongly that schools should reopen. But what about the families where a member of the household is older or has some comorbidities, or the families where the child, him or herself, has a health condition? They may not be as comfortable with their child going back to school. Okay, you say, we'll give the parents a choice, let the parents choose, but the issue here is that that's just not feasible. It would be a nightmare in many districts to have these two separate tracks with the majority of children back at school in person and the minority staying at home. These are complicated issues, and I think as always, it's important to try to view it not only from our immediate personal perspective, but also from the perspective of others who may be experiencing different life circumstances than we are. Thank you again so much for watching this video. I really appreciate your time. Please be sure to comment below your opinion on this issue. Thanks again, and I will see you in the next video. Bye-bye.